in the book, 9 Steps to Financial Freedom, Susie Orman speaks of a time when she was 13 years old. Her dad owned this business, which was this tiny shack where he sold chicken and ribs and hamburgers and hot dogs and French fries. Well, on this particular day, a day in which Susie said she'll never forget, the oil that the chicken was fried in caught fire. In a few minutes, the whole place, the whole business just exploded in flames. Her dad bolted from the store before the flames could engulf him. And as 13-year-old Susie and her mom stood outside watching the fire burn away her dad's business, suddenly her dad realized that he had left his money in the metal cash register inside the building. Susie then watched in disbelief as her dad ran back into the inferno before anyone could stop him. He tried to open this metal register to get all his money out, but the intense heat had already sealed the drawer shut. He couldn't get the drawer open. Knowing that every penny he had was locked in front of him, about to go up into flames, he picked up this scalding metal box and he carried the box outside with him. And when he threw the register on the ground, the flesh on his arms and on his chest came with it. He had escaped the fire safely untouched one time, but when he voluntarily risked his life, and he was severely injured. The money was that important to him that he went back into a burning building. And Susie Orman said this. She said, that was when I learned that money is obviously more important than life itself. And from that point on, earning money, lots of money, not only became what drove me professionally, but also became my emotional priority. And as you may know, Susie Orman has devoted her entire life to making money and advising people on money matters. But the question is, what drives your life? What drives my life? You see, what we value drives our behavior. And as we'll see this morning, to be well off isn't determined by how much money you make or some other thing you may put your value in, but rather to be well off, it's to live according to the values of another kingdom. Well, we began our study last week on the greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount. You'll find it in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And we're going to be devoting the next few months to the Sermon on the Mount. And as we read through the words of Jesus here in this sermon, it really is a window into Jesus' heart. Well, I invite you to turn to the beginning of that sermon in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5. You might recall last week I was going to try and include these verses here, 1 through 12, in with the sermon last week, and you would have been here all afternoon. I spared you that. We put it into 2 here. But last time what I did try to accomplish was to do a flyby of the sermon, flying 40,000 feet over these 3 chapters to help us get started and to get the most of our study as we began. And I gave 6 handles last week for us to kind of grab a hold of as we work through this greatest sermon ever. And I want to just simply state those again. In this greatest sermon ever, first of all, it's all about life in the kingdom. Handle number 1, it's all about life in the kingdom. Secondly, in this greatest sermon ever, Jesus tells us the truth about reality. Thirdly, in this greatest sermon ever, we will hear things that feel impossible to obey. In this greatest sermon ever, fourthly, Jesus establishes a standard of living counter to everything the world holds dear. Fifthly, this greatest sermon ever, it is aimed at the heart. And then lastly, in this greatest sermon ever, we find the way to an experience, an abundant, flourishing life. It is here through these chapters we can have a sustainable faith. So having said that, look with me at Matthew chapter 5. And as verses 1 and 2 inform us, Jesus is speaking to his disciples, but not only to his disciples, but to the crowd, made up of Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, and Essenes, who are also listening in. Verse 1. Matthew 5, verse 1. Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he, meaning Jesus, began to teach them. Now it's in verse 3 that Jesus introduces his sermon. He sets it all up with eight shocking statements that seem backwards and ridiculous. That's what we're going to see all the way through. What Jesus says here only makes sense if there's a different kingdom than merely this earth. And in a series of paradoxical announcements, Jesus boils it all down to what is going to drive your life and what is going to drive my life. Now, as we look at these verses here, 3 through 12, and these statements, it really all comes down under this umbrella. Really, if you want to have a takeaway, it's this morning, that there's a call here to a Jesus-ruled life. There's a call here to a Jesus-ruled life. In other words, what we have in these verses is what our lives will look like when God takes control. Now, you need to know it's no easy thing to try and take 8 statements like we have this morning and force them into a nice, neat outline. If you know anything about me, as you've seen, I like to have those outlines. For your sake, yes, but also for my sake. But I couldn't do it with these 8 statements. Now, there are preachers out there that could do it. They're obviously better than me, but I couldn't do it, and anything I came up with felt contrived. And so you're going to have to bear with me this morning as we work through these verses in Matthew 5, 3 through 12. It's not going to fit into these nice categories, okay? We together here? So just stay with me. We're going to work through this. We come to what's commonly called what? The Beatitudes. The Beatitudes. Why are they called the Beatitudes? Well, a Sunday school teacher asked her class of 3rd graders, what are the Beatitudes? What are the Beatitudes? One girl raised her hand and answered, the Beatitudes are the attitudes we ought to be at. Not bad. The attitudes we ought to be at. I kind of like R.T. Francis' idea around what are the Beatitudes. He says the Beatitudes are descriptions and commendations of the good life. It is a pocket guide to life in the kingdom of heaven. Now, the word beatitude, by the way, is a rough translation of the Latin word beatus, meaning blessed, fortunate, blissful, favored. Jesus gives his take on the person who is favored by God. Jesus gives us his take on the person who is well off. And it isn't what we commonly think. Look at verse 3 through 5. Blessed or happy or well off are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Well off are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed, well off are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, for Jesus to begin his sermon by speaking of the poor and the mournful and the meek as the ones who are well off, well, you can just imagine that the crowd probably gasped at that point. Many in the crowd that day believed that God's blessing, God's favor rested on the wealthy, rested on the healthy, and the males who were keepers of the law. And Jesus comes along here and he drops his bombshell on that mountain that day when he says, blessed, happy, well off are the poor in spirit. And the word picture of the poor is of a beggar who's kind of slumped over and just cringing in fear as other people go by. poor, the sick, the lame, the broken, the desperate. They were looked down upon in shame in that society in that day. And just as any preacher looks for a hook to draw his hearers in with his opening words, his introduction, Jesus immediately had the attention of his congregation with these words, especially the religious leaders of the day. The narrowness of their teaching was at odds with the wide open invitation that Jesus gives to all. Now, Jesus didn't have to say, blessed or happy or well off are the rich. Happy or blessed are the popular. Well off are the highly valued. He didn't have to say that because they were already viewed that way by society. What they didn't believe is that the poor, mournful, meek have equal opportunity in the kingdom. Now imagine with me this morning, put yourself at the mountainside where Jesus is giving this service, he's giving these words, and imagine with me another group of people who stood in that crowd that day. Consider those who stood away from everyone else, those who were looked down upon by society's well-off, fortunate class of people. Picture them. And can you imagine the marginalized and the outcast standing nearby that day, hearing Jesus' opening words, and then he says, poor are the spirits. They must have just said, wow, is he talking to me? What breath of fresh air for them to hear that. They'd never been told they were well off. This really is good news. And Jesus still looks into the eyes of the drug addict. Jesus looks into the eyes of the prostitute. Jesus looks into the eyes of the one messed up by bad choices. He looks into the eyes of the homeless and the abused and the left out and the overlooked and the unpopular and the ordinary. He looks into the eyes of the misunderstood and he says, you are invited to enter into my blessing. You can be well off. Well, how to be well off? Jesus says, be poor in spirit. Jesus is not saying that all the poor on the earth are blessed by Jesus. There's a spiritual dynamic to this. It says in spirit. What it is, it's getting at this point here that we are to recognize our need. We recognize our brokenness. We recognize how desperate we are, and we accept Jesus' invitation to life in the kingdom. You see, our culture says, those who are well off are the ones with the most stuff. Our culture says the ones who are well off are the ones who make it to the top, the ones who are driven to succeed. Jesus turns the value system of earth on its head. And he says the ones who are truly well off and favored by God are the broken, the desperate, and the humble. He says the ones who are well off are the ones who aren't happy with earth's happiness only. Now, here's a test we can all take. Complete this statement. I would be happy if. Be honest. I would be happy if. Well, we might answer that by saying, I'd be happy if I had a little more money than I have. I'd be happy if my kids made better choices. I'd be happy if I can get out from my parents. That's going to be the day that I'm really happy. I would be happy if I could have someone I could spend the rest of my life with. That would make me the happiest. I would be happy if that annoying person at work found another job. That would make me happy. I would be happy if. If you're struggling to be happy, to experience the good life, to discover a profound contentedness, then one place to look might be to ask, what's driving your life? How have you been driven by trying to get all these pleasures that are fleeting? that have only led to restlessness and complacency and a numbness to your need of God. See, the well-off, according to Jesus, are those who don't settle for earth's happiness only. It's to be happy with heaven's happiness. It's to be poor in spirit. My challenge to you today, if you're kind of going in this direction where you're trying to get earth's happiness, and that's where you'd be most happy if you can get all of earth's happiness, or at least a little bit more than you have, then I would challenge you to admit it today that you're headed in a wrong direction. On a flight to Chicago, the pilot announced that the takeoff had been delayed due to mechanical failure. And forgetting that the intercom was still on, the pilot was overheard in the background saying, "Whoops, not what you want to hear from your pilot," just like you would want to hear that from your surgeon. Well, a minute later, the pilot headed down the aisle toward the rear exit ramp with his hat in one hand and his briefcase in the other. And one of the passengers saw the pilot and asked him, "Where you going?" The pilot answered in a very low voice, "Denver." The passenger replied, "This plane's not going to Denver, it's going to Chicago." "I know," the pilot said with his face turning red. "I am on the wrong plane." Are you on the wrong plane? Are you on the wrong plane? Is it time to get off? You're looking for earth's happiness only. It's time to admit that. See, the rest of the Beatitudes here stand and begin on this honest admission of trying to make it on your own, that you want to rule your own life. Now, isn't that the issue for most of us, that we just kind of want to have life under control? I just want to be able to manage things around me. And yet, in life, things just aren't quite going the way I thought they would. Let me tell you, that's good. That's a good thing, really, for it pushes us to a greater sense of needing God. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, how would you rate your sense of need for God right now? Where are you? Well, Jesus goes on in verse 4, and he says, "Blessed or well off are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." This is built on the first one, of being poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. What's Jesus saying here? Is he saying we just kind of need to walk around with sad faces, crying all the time? That we fit the stereotype of the little girl who exclaimed, "Oh, that horse must be a Christian. It's got such a long face." Charles Spurgeon said, "Some Christians seem to have their neckties twisted around their souls." Reminds me of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He was a member of the U.S. Supreme Court for 30 years, and his mind and his wit and his work earned him the unofficial title of the greatest justice since John Marshall. Well, at one point in his life, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes explained his choice of a career by saying this. He said, "I might have entered the ministry if certain clergymen I knew had not looked and acted so much like undertakers." We do sometimes. Carrying a heavy load. Well, is that what he's saying here? We just walk around that way? Now, what is this mournfulness all about? It's not about being morbid. We're to enjoy hearty laughter. It says, one person put it, "Laugh full, but weep deep, weep more." Laugh full, but weep deep, weep more. You see, life in the kingdom, and if we adopt Jesus' values and we're under his rule, it's going to lead to mourning over injustice in the world. There's plenty of it. It's going to be mourning over lost souls, more. It's going to be a deeper mourning for our country and its cesspool of sin. We'll mourn. See, if we live life under Jesus' rule, that personal loss we're experiencing right now, or that sinful choice before a holy God, will mourn. We'll mourn. And that's not how we operate. We'd rather dodge around the pain and look for ways to numb it. And so when life gets hard and it's heavy, our drug of choice can be many things, but one drug of choice for us is kind of ease that pain through laughter, silly sitcoms on TV, for example. Jesus says there's a better way. Face the pain, mourn the loss, and it is there you'll know the comfort from God himself. Jesus says that what we might see to be unblessable condition, that which is painful and unpleasant, can actually be blessed. When we live under Jesus' rule, we don't grieve like those who don't know Christ. We find comfort because we know the God who is in control. We find comfort because we know laughter and joy awaits us. We find comfort because we know that God gets the final word, that we will see our loved ones who knew Christ again, that there will be a day of no more tears, and that what we ultimately experience in heaven far outweighs any of our suffering here. Blessed are those who mourn. Jesus continues, verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, meek's a little difficult to define. It seems to have an aspect to it describing those who cannot defend themselves against attackers and someone would come in and just take over all their land. That's why he says you'll inherit the earth. That they can't retaliate even if they wanted to, which the world mocks as weak and spineless. The word meek, by the way, was used for a horse that had to be broken. A wild stallion that had been tamed, brought under control, is described as meek. It's not weakness. So as we kind of combine these thoughts here, we could conclude that meekness is one who will not retaliate when wronged, will not get even when sinned against, but instead demonstrate a strength under control. Jesus was a living beatitude. Jesus was meek. He had the power at any moment to call upon hundreds of angels to come to his side and wipe out all his accusers. He had the power to come off of that cross and save himself from the humiliation, the agony, and the death, but he chose restraint. He had strength under control. That's meekness. It's been said, anyone can fight. It takes a strong person to resist. Are you meek? Are you meek? Or is yours kind of an attitude of entitlement? Do you kind of strut around to say, as if to say, do you know who I am? Do you throw your weight around? Do you bully others? Do you take matters into your own hands? Do you get your own way through force and manipulation and intimidation? Do you? You're not meek. Jesus says that's not God approved. It's not the way to be well off in God's eyes. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the poor in spirit. All requires what? Humility. And Jesus goes on in verse 6. He says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. So it begs the question, what do you hunger and thirst after? If it can be filled by this earth, we're aiming too low. Are we living to be full now? We'll be empty later. He will fill us. And it's only then that we know the soul satisfaction of a life filled with Christ, when we hunger for righteousness, when we thirst hard after God, that we can't do without Him. During the liberation of Palestine in World War I, combined force of British, Australian, and New Zealand soldiers was closely pursuing the Turks as they retreated from the desert. As the Allied troops moved northward past Beersheba, they began to outdistance their water-carrying camel train. And so that when the water ran out, their mouths got dry, their heads ached, they became dizzy and faint, eyes became bloodshot, lips swelled and turned purple, and mirages became very common. They knew that if they did not make the wells of Sharia by nightfall, thousands of them would die. Hundreds had already died. And literally, fighting for their lives, they managed to drive the Turks from Sharia. And the first thing they saw there were great stone cisterns full of cold drinking water. In the still night, the sound of water running into the tanks could be distinctly heard. And as water was distributed from the great stone cisterns, the more abled bodies were required to stand at attention and wait while the wounded and the other guard who'd go on guard duty first, they got to drink first, and they just had to stand there, and it's right there in front of them. They can't do anything about it. It was 4 hours before the last man had his drink. And during that time, the men stood no more than 20 feet from the thousands of gallons of water to drink, of which had been their consuming passion for many agonizing days. And one officer reported this. He said, if such were the thirst for God, for righteousness, for His will in our lives, a consuming, all-embracing, preoccupying desire, how rich in the fruit of the Spirit would we be? How great is your thirst for righteousness? What is it that you cannot do without? Well, we continue with Jesus' words of a life well off, verse 7. Now, I can see how some pastors developed 8 sermons from these 8 Beatitudes. We're on number 5. Probably shouldn't have told you that. Some commentators have suggested that the last 4 Beatitudes are outward manifestations of the first 4. Perhaps, I'll let you decide. But look at verse 7. Jesus says, blessed or well off are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Again, Jesus turns the values of this culture on its head, because in our society, what is it all about? It is about fairness. That's not fair. And if you're like me, parents, you hear your kids say that, and like Pavlov's dogs, we quickly reply with, well, life isn't always fair. But come on, secretly, we want it to be. See, this cry of it's not fair is not just for kids. It often drives our reactions and our decisions, because we are bent to react to those who violate our personal view of fairness. You treat me that way, then I will give you what you deserve. You will not get away with that. How merciful are you? How merciful am I? How merciful are we to should violators? To should violators. What I mean is, each person in this room has a set of beliefs as to how he or she should be treated. We all have them. I should have that parking space. I saw it first. The store should open up another lane here at the registers, because obviously this one's too long. They should do that. I shouldn't be treated this way. My boss should notice my contributions. I should be treated better for all that I do. My spouse should know what I need. I mean, it all sounds reasonable, but what happens when one of those beliefs are violated? We want some compensation or justice. Think of how that played out for you this past week. And we don't get it, what happens? We're miserable. See, the longer our list of shoulds, the constant supply of should violators. And so the cry of our heart is what? That's not fair. That's not fair. What if God were merely fair? What if we got what we deserve? I mean, would we really? I have to ask myself this a lot. Would I really want God to treat me like I treat other people? Oh, how undeserving we are of God's love and forgiveness. And to grasp that is to be well off as we extend the mercy to the undeserving, the ungrateful, the should violators. Well off are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart, Jesus says in verse 8, for they will see God. Oh, who can ever be pure in heart? It seems to elude us. C.S. Lewis said, "I have never had a selfless thought." That's how it seems. I mean, aren't our motives often mixed at best, pure in heart? Well, the thought of this speaks to one's focus in life. It means to be single-minded in our desire to know and to honor the Lord. And when we're living that way and pure in heart, single-minded devotion to God, we then can see God. We can see God in His beauty. We can see God in His presence. We see God in His goodness. And we taste just how much better being close to Him is. It's better anything than sin can offer. And when we aren't single-minded and we're double-minded, we're going all over the place, we're not pure in heart, then our whole view of God is off. We become distant of Him, and obedience seems like a chore. There's a better way, Jesus says, and that's to place ourselves under the rule of Christ, where we enjoy His presence. We experience the peace that comes in knowing that He is in control. Staying locked into single-mindedness, purity of devotion, it is there that we know peace. And that naturally leads to the next beatitude, verse 9. We're getting there. Verse 9, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." Now think about this. To be called sons of God is to say that when we are peacemakers, we are acting like His children. We're doing what our Heavenly Father does. Because God has gone to great lengths to reconcile sinners to Himself. We remember that this morning. See, we imitate Him when we're doing the hard work of pursuing reconciliation. Perhaps you might even say we're never more like God than when we can bring people together who are at odds with each other. So, in what situation then are you in right now where you can lessen tension, or you could seek some solutions, or you could foster reconciliation? Be a peacemaker. Is there a broken relationship calling for you to pursue reconciliation? I mean, it may not work out that way, but we're reminded in Romans, as far as it depends on us, live at peace with everyone. See, to step up and be that peacemaker, what's that saying? There are times it won't be well received by others. We won't get there. See, to live out any of these Beatitudes doesn't suggest for a minute that all of life's going to go smoothly. To be meek or to be merciful, to be hungering for what is right, might be met with resistance. See, to be well off isn't the same as this feel-good Christianity that's often advertised. Jesus isn't talking about this hot tub experience that's relaxing and laid back, not in any way demanding and that all is well. No, as a matter of fact, on the contrary, if you stand for what is right, if you go against the grain of culture, if you embrace Jesus' values over the values of this world, you can pretty much figure that others will not take to it too kindly. Following Jesus is dangerous. He says that in verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus wants to spend a little extra time on this one. He further explains it, verse 11. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, falsely say all kinds of evil things against you because of me. Verse 12. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now you need to note here that Jesus is clear as to the reason for persecution. It is because of righteousness and because of me, Jesus says in verse 11. If people hate you because you're being a jerk, or if people hate you because you're being nasty and you're being obnoxious, or because you're placing tracts all over the lunchroom, or you're preaching when you should be working, that's on you. Don't apply this verse. Don't call it persecution for your faith. Call it just being dumb. But when you're pursuing heaven's goals, we will feel earth's hatred. We choose to not lie, or we choose to stand up for justice and go against the grain, we will face backlash. Are you okay with that? Are you driven by the approval of God over the approval and praise of others? For Jesus says, you're well off when you're persecuted for His sake. That's a tough one, because persecution is not valued. Being liked by all is. See, some will want what we have, and others will mock us, and others will insult us, and they may even ostracize us because of it. But it means then that we are to interact with the world. We can't separate ourselves from the world. It means we're engaging the world. It means we're interacting with people in our culture and living out the reality of the kingdom. The thing we need to remember about these Beatitudes is that we are to become living Beatitudes. Living Beatitudes. These Beatitudes are characteristics of true followers of Christ. These are true for anyone who says, I am a follower of Christ. This is life in the kingdom. Those who are living under Jesus' rule live like this. Jesus is saying here, when God takes control of our lives, this is what it's going to look like. When we live like this, we're well off, Jesus says. We are blessed. And the blessed are to bless. The blessed are to bless. Jesus invites us to see the marginalized in our society and the outcast and the type of people that the world overlooks, the one whose lives have been broken by bad choices. Those are the people God welcomes in the kingdom of heaven. And we are to be witnesses for another way of life, as we're going to look at next week. Church, let's become living Beatitudes to those in need. Let's become living Beatitudes. These things. James Bryant Smith tells of a man he met named Kevin. It was in a church service that he was visiting when Kevin stood up before his church family to share his testimony. The only problem with Kevin sharing his testimony was that Kevin could not speak. He barely made sounds. He had been born with Down syndrome and a host of other physical ailments. And so as he came up to give his testimony, the pastor stood with Kevin right next to him, asking him yes or no questions, to which he would nod and grunt and occasionally just light up with a great big smile. So the pastor asked him, so Kevin, you just got back from the Special Olympics where you won a medal, right? Kevin nodded furiously and smiled as he held his medal high. The pastor then went on to explain how Kevin might have won more medals that day, but he stopped in every race to help other runners who had fallen, who were lagging behind. Living Beatitude. When he was asked about why he had such joy in his life, Kevin simply pointed up. He then held his arms outstretched as if he were Jesus on the cross, and then he used sign language to help explain Jesus' love for all of them. Kevin was a living beatitude. He was a living beatitude in his congregation. He showed mercy to those in his church who were elderly and lost their spouses. And he'd go to that surviving spouse and he'd look in that person's eyes and he would touch his finger to his eye and then run it down his cheek and then put his hands together in a posture of prayer. And then he'd go and give him a great big hug and then walk away. He'd do that over and over again. And leave. Without words, he conveyed, I am sad with you. I am praying for you. I love you. And the people in that church all said the same thing. Of all the people who helped me after I lost my spouse, Kevin helped me the most with my grief. A living beatitude. A living beatitude. His condition might have seemed unblessable in the kingdom of this world. No one would choose his situation. From the world's perspective, Kevin had nothing going for him. Rejected by the world, yet welcomed and well off in God's kingdom. Will you, will I, live under the rule of Christ and let His power shine through our lives to live these qualities out? Will we be a living beatitude?